Hey, folks, my guest today, Josh Howes, is a city manager for the City of Calgary when it comes to secondary suites. We have an amazing conversation about what's going on in Calgary, how it impacts investors, and what you need to know to actually take action to really stay ahead of the curve in terms of what they are seeing and what they're wanting to do with this Calgary initiative around secondary suites. Fascinating conversation. Josh is a well-spoken manager of his team. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation. Before we get into it, just a reminder, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, make sure you hit the comments. Give us some insights into what you learned, what you think about it, if you liked this particular conversation, and we can bring more to you. Enjoy the show. Hey folks, welcome to the Rain channel. Today I am joined by Josh Howes, who is the City of Calgary Secondary Suites Manager. Is that correct?
Yeah, program manager for secondary suites. Yeah.
Okay. So, for investors who are looking at expanding their portfolio, many of you know that we've been very bullish on Calgary for a number of years. And certainly we look at all of the economic fundamentals that are driving real estate, from GDP growth to unemployment and or employment, and of course, population growth. But in amongst all of that is, we want to look at the economic development. We want to look at the progressive nature of the city, in this case, the City of Calgary. And, when we're seeing what's happening in the secondary suites space, if you will, Josh, you came out to our live event not that long ago, and we're kind of shining a light on some of the opportunities that investors have given what Calgary's doing. So why don't we expand on that? And let's start by first just asking the question. Now, you're manager of secondary suites in Calgary for the City of Calgary. What does that even mean? What does that entail, if you will? Just kind of a brief overview of what it is that is the nature of what you do.
Yeah, sure. Great question. My position is actually a temporary position. I worked as the executive advisor to the director in the area for a while, and we've been working on and investing in suites as a city for quite a while. And 2 years ago, we had some budget approved for some additional staff specific for suites. And what we found is that we needed somebody to really lead that team. So we've had some additional resources specific for suites for a couple of years now. And recently, within the last 6 months, I've been asked to go and take actually leadership of that team and put together a little bit more structure around the suites program here at the city.
Now, as I said in the intro, I think that we, as investors, when we look at a city or a town or whatever it might be, economic development is one aspect of it. But then when we look at infrastructure and, what is the actual city looking into the future? So I consider this initiative of secondary suites with City of Calgary, quite progressive. What's behind the initiative, or in Calgary, secondary suites has been a topic several times over the years. What is the catalyst for this particular change and this initiative that they've launched?
Sure. I like to tell a little story with this one. It's what I shared at the live event. I'll share it here. My family came back to Calgary when I was about 3 years old. They were in Calgary before. We moved away from my dad's work for a little bit and came back. When we did so, we ended up living in a house in Albert Park in Calgary here. And in the basement, there was a kitchenette unit down there. When we lived there, we lived in the whole house. When we moved out, family members moved in, my grandma moved in, my cousin moved in. And at some point in time, it became clear that that space in the basement could be used separately for someone to live, separate from somebody upstairs. Now, the way that the staircase was and everything else, it wasn't truly a secondary suite at the time. But as time went on, as my dad owned that and rented that out for years and years afterwards, he owned it probably for 30 years and rented it out for 28 of those years, we realized that it was truly operating as a secondary suite. When I started working at the city, I come to find out that it was an illegal secondary suite. It wasn't allowed to be there. And I went to my dad and I said, Dad, you're a good guy. You're an honest dude. What's going on? And he said, okay, well, let's legalize it. And I went in, and sure enough, even though I worked at the city, it was impossible to legalize that suite. The regulations didn't allow for a lot the size that house was on to have a legal suite in it, no matter what you did. Other people found that they had to go to council to ask for land use redesignation changes and thousands of dollars just to be allowed for the opportunity to develop a legal safe suite. And that framework is what existed in Calgary back in the early 2000s, into the late 2000s and early 2010s.
Yeah.
When it became clear that that was a limiting factor for proper good development, the city took some steps along the way to make some improvements to that. That started back in 2023 initially, 2013 initially, where the land use bylaw expanded the ability to add suites to more areas than it did before. That was the start of the movement for the city of Calgary. So rather than needing a redesignation, rather than not being allowed within most of the residential properties, we started to shift towards that. That was doubled down on in and around 2018, where the biggest changes were made. Now that it was allowed from a land use perspective, we took some really big steps on the building side. We took some steps to say, okay, we know that when originally this was put in years ago, there weren't the same code requirements as today, but you couldn't do it legally because of the land use bylaw. And now that you can legally do it due to the land use bylaw, we're trying to make it so that you can follow a bare minimum site safety. I'm going to get my words wrong here. A minimum code compliance for safety for those suites that was really based off of an interpretation from the province that came from fire code. Some original fire code, which really said minimum life safety standards are that people can hear, know about, and escape from a fire. That's the primary concern and safety in a home. And so while there were requirements within the current code to also require for split heating source, to require for sound dampening in the bedrooms, and a couple of other elements, if existing prior to March 2018 in the city of Calgary, this minimum life safety standard was set and established and is used. It allows for people to make the renovations that they need to do to legalize and register their suites in the city of Calgary without having to hit that full new code compliance standard, focused on the safety elements so that the people living in these spaces are safe and they have a high quality standard of living within that space. Since that time, we have seen our registry absolutely explode. So leading up until 2018, we had only 1,000 legal suites in the city of Calgary over its entire history. Over the last 5 years and a bit, we have seen that go increase by almost 11,000 additional units. So we're coming up on 12,000 legal suites in the city of Calgary. I like to point out that the city of Calgary has built 0 of those. Those have all been built by individuals that were doing the right thing. In between 2018 and 2023, sure enough, my dad legalized the suite in his old house. He actually did so to the full new standards. He decided he had to put a new furnace in anyways. He made that shift and switch. He had the opportunity to do so, and he did it. But as soon as really the opportunity in the legal space for him to do it was in place, he was willing to do so. And I think that we've seen that from investors across the city, that once the framework and the path was put in place to allow for those investments into those spaces, and the legalization and registration of suites has been allowed, that people have flooded to that market to take existing illegals and convert them into properly registered and safe secondary suites, ensuring the investments, like protecting the investments that they have in these properties, really, by protecting the people that are in them.
I want to go back a little bit, Josh, as a few things you said, but also just my experience in there at the time. Lot size aside, and given that you find there's only was 1,000 units legal technically. I mean, the city of Calgary was willing to kind of turn a blind eye to what was really going on with secondary suites, given or as long as there weren't complaints. As soon as the bylaw was facing complaints, then of course it shone a light, and there was individuals that got caught upside down in terms of what their suite was or wasn't, and that caused some headaches. But often what drove that was less about suite size and more about parking. So I'm interested to hear about what did they change in terms of parking, because that's where a lot of the NIMBYism, if you will, to use that phrase, kind of kicks into gear, because neighbors get uptight because all of a sudden there's a legal suite and now there's parking and I can't park my car. I've been parking there for 30 years. How did Calgary address that particular issue, Josh?
Sure. So the land use bylaw does currently still require a parking stall, an additional parking stall for a legal secondary suite. Generally speaking, that means you bring a requirements of parking on the site to two parking stalls. There are some standards where actually it's three, and there's some situations where it's less. Specifically, small suites under 420 square feet, they don't require that additional parking stall, but a normal standard size suite does. Recently, within the Housing Affordability Task Force recommendations to the City of Calgary, there is some work towards actually removing all residential parking requirements across the City of Calgary. When that initially came to council, it was turned down. It came back again a month or two later, and the wording on that was changed a little bit to saying that they don't want parking to be a detriment to development in the City of Calgary. Those words were then approved by council. Now, we are in a point now where we're waiting for the blanket rezoning piece to come back through to the city, formal legal processes, and along with that will come some adjustments and changes to the requirements for parking in residential in the City of Calgary. And I don't have assurances right now as to exactly where that's going to pan out, but what you can say is that council has approved the framework that says parking won't be a limiting factor to development, meaning that even if there is a process that's required, the support system there to relax those when it's not plausible, but it makes sense because of closeness to transit or wherever it may be, that assurance from the city and the direction from the city is to not limit development based off of the requirements of parking.
So, I mean, I look at what's going on in Calgary and you see some of the newer areas, and certainly there are purpose-built, we'll call them duplexes going up, and even in a kind of a row housing style where you've got up down suite, they've got a double garage. They're kind of set up and designed for that. But when we go back into some parts of Calgary and you look at some of the old bungalows that may or may not have a garage, may or may not have parking beside the house, it all goes down to street parking. And in those scenarios, how is that being handled? And I want to go back a little bit. So in Vancouver, Lower Mainland, they're taking parking restrictions right off. So now, because they've taken single family zoning and changed it all, there is none. You can put fourplexes, eightplex, depending on lot size, anywhere you want. They've taken all of the parking restrictions that might have come along with that off the table right now. Back to Calgary, they haven't done that yet. So if you've only got access to street parking, is there an allowance or some conditions around that?
Yeah, so we would never view street parking as a formal, like a stall or something, because obviously public parking is for everyone and not just for the individuals in the suite. But what I can say is that when we do see development permits currently, when they're still required, because often in the City of Calgary, we actually don't even require one for a suite. You can, under at least half of the permits that are going through right now, you straight to building permit. You don't even need a development permit. But in the positions where we do need development permits, it is for the purpose of reviewing the parking. If there isn't room to have two stalls accessible on the site for the owner, one for the suite, then that review is done. And I would say that we see a consistent approval of suites without both parking stalls based off of all sorts of different factors, including transit, street parking, accessibility, and all sorts of other pieces. They're referred to, they're understood as the rationale and the discretion. They're not directly approved, because in order to do so, you would have to take public parking, remove it, and say, hey, this stall is available only to residents and whatever it may be, in order to truly attach the development permit approval to that parking stall. But relaxations for parking associated with suite are something that we see fairly consistently, as long as the rationale and the fit and the effect on the neighbors is not extreme, basically.
So what's the process in all of this, Josh? So for example, if I've got what we call as a non-conforming suite or an illegal suite, and I say, okay, I want to upgrade it, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, my memory bank's going back, is that Calgary's also giving you some form of a, whatever, check mark, official legal suite, or whatever they're terming it. I think that's the case, is it not?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
we went with a registry. So we
Okay.
have, and we would refer to term wise, we would say you have an unregistered suite or you have a registered suite.
Got it. So if I've got an unregistered suite, a non-conforming suite, I say, okay, at bare minimum, I want to make sure that I meet the standards of safety that City of Calgary has put in place. What's my process? Do I go? Do I have to get drawings put together? How do I approach this with an existing unit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually part of the city's overall process. While we made those high level, or council made some of those high level, decisions, we internally at the city in the procedural side also made a number of adjustments to simplify the process for people, specifically around existing suites. Now, when we talk about new suites, we are talking about, developing area where you're, building a new home and you check off granite countertops and you check off new lighting fixtures and you check off solar panels maybe, and then you can check off a secondary suite. And it's like it is a standard object that comes in new development and new construction. But specifically when we focus on the developed area and the existing suites, we are looking at a situation where there's two potential primary paths. The first is that you need to apply for a development permit. Under the circumstances where you live in a zoning that make it discretionary, then that is the requirement off the bat. About half of our suites that are converting, we do see that process going on. If, however, you're in a zoning that's an RC2, an RCG, any number of other ones, about half the city, they are permitted for suites, which means that as long as you meet the rules, there's no need for a development permit because it is permitted. And so you jump straight to the building permit. Under those circumstances, we removed a lot of the requirements on the building permit. So if it's an existing suite, we actually require some very baseline information from the applicant. We ask for some pictures of the space. We don't even ask for a floor plan currently. Now it's something that may come back in at some point in time, but we don't actually currently ask for a floor plan. And we go out with an inspector early on for the rough inspection stage, and we make sure that people are aware of exactly the elements that they need to upgrade and complete before we could come back and sign off on that. So literally your process is, if you need, trades, yes, electrical, plumbing, you have to apply for those permits, but the building permit is the primary permit needed for a lot of, and that's it. You apply online, you take some pictures, you upload those for us, and then we work through that process. We issue you a permit with the proper conditions, and then we inspect at the end of that process. We make sure your trades are in place. And right now we're waiving the fee associated with the registry so that you don't pay that $230 even. And at the end of all of those things, when everything's in place, we put you on the registry, we send you a couple stickers, and you show up on the website as a registered suite. Under the circumstances where you do need that development permit, to the front end of that process, you make a development permit application. The requirements are really quite small as far as a development permit goes as well. We're looking at a couple of other elements, including the parking, specifically in an amenity space. And we're looking at some of those effects. They make a determination based off of the location and the rationale as to whether or not a suite is a relevant or a reasonable thing to have in that area. And that approval takes about 3 months. So if you don't need the DP, you're literally looking at an issued permit within a week. If you're looking at a DP, you got to add that 3 months to the process.
Right. So take some time. So what's behind all this? I got two questions for you. When you look at the city of Calgary and their kind of being progressive in this all, is it really just because they were seeing where supply was just being a challenge and they were feeling some, I guess, unintended consequences of that experience? Or what was really the kind of the driver or the catalyst behind all of this, Josh?
Sure, great question. I can only speak for what I've seen from my perspective. I can't speak for all 15 councillors that voted in one way or another. And I will say, at the very front end of this, it was as tight a vote as you could possibly see. More recently, when we see votes in and around developments around suites, we see a fairly easy majority that is coming through. But originally, this was extremely contentious for the city still. There was a lot of NIMBYism still around it, and so they were navigating that for sure. I would say for sure back in 2015, 2018, it was not a supply concern. The city of Calgary wasn't necessarily short on housing units or supply, and rents weren't skyrocketing like they are now. It was primarily a concern of, we knew that there were good people trying to do the right thing that had no path to compliance. And I think in general, the city recognized that that was an issue. When you had no path for people to do it without going to council. And what started to happen, and this is my direct experience, we started to see a lot of sob stories hitting counselors at council, and they would sit there for hours watching people trying to convert their zoning so that they would be able to keep a suite in which their mother lived in, or their handicapped son lived in. And they would come through with these difficult stories, really pulling at the heartstrings of counselors. And they were like, we're making planning decisions based off of individual stories. And they were saying, there's something wrong here. There's something missing. We have created an environment where the framework for proper development isn't there, and they recognize the need to make that adjustment. And so that was really what I would say triggered back in early 2010s. The initial triggering was saying, hey, we don't, as a council, want to sit here making individual decisions on one-off properties that cost $10,000 and take 6 months just to get it here. We really want to open that framework up, give some direction to the staff, put some rules in place that give people some clarity and some assurance around what will be approved and what won't. And they took the steps to give that to administration. And since then, administration has continued to improve and simplify the process while following with those base understanding and expectations of council around a reasonable development of suites. While they've been opened up and the opportunity and the possibility for them is everywhere, there are certain circumstances where the city still views it's not appropriate to put a suite in. And so those are clear within our framework, within our redevelopment areas. Sometimes that even happens in a space where we just prefer to see a larger development. I mean, certainly that happens from time to time. But when you go from less than 1,000 in its entire history to this year, we're seeing applications approaching the 2,800 registries in one single year, and that will be our largest year yet. That framework and that base is obviously encouraging that development and that investment by people. More recently, I'll finish one more. Yeah. More recently, the additional pieces supporting an incentive, further extending the amnesty for an additional 3 years, which we expect to see at council later this month. It already hit committee. Those, I think, are primarily driven from an housing affordability concern and issue, where we are trying to desperately add to supply of homes in the city of Calgary, and suites are viewed as a great opportunity and way to do that increase. And so over the last year or so, I think that some of the actions there are very specific to increasing supply.
When I'm listening to you, you talk about going from 1,000 to 11,000 with 2,800 new permits. We look at that, and on the surface, one might assume off the top that, that's a real increase in supply. But the reality of it is, it's probably not that big a new increase in supply, although it's there, because those were already existing units. They were there being rented and lived in one way or the other. All this has done is bring them to the forefront, made them safer, made them technically legal, if we use that term, conforming suites. So in some regards, it probably didn't add a lot to the supply, but I know it'd probably be anecdotal, but what's your thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, actually love the conversation, because it's, in some ways, there's some truth to it. I always kind of question anybody that would look at an illegal suite and say, oh yeah, that's a spot where somebody lives, and when we legalize it, we don't count it towards anything. It's a really slippery slope, I think, for people to say, oh yeah, we're totally okay with people living in an unsafe, unapproved manner. That being said, of the 11,000 currently approaching 12,000 on the registry, 7,000 are existing conversions. Another 5,000 are new. And now when I say new, that could be that it existed before, but it hit full new compliance. So when we are looking at it, we are defining those terms based off of full compliance. So my dad's previously existing suite that he fully did to the new code technically will count as a check mark towards the new. But we do see that split. And what we're actually seeing in the city of Calgary, and this is one of the reasons we continue to push the amnesty program, but also considering its incentives, is that 2 years ago we saw 2,000 conversions. Last year, 1,200. This year we'll see 1,000. Sorry, meaning that what we've actually always assumed and know is that the first conversion was the easiest one, And as we've gone through 7,000 of what we consider, possibly tens of thousands more, they get harder and harder, whether that be because the spaces themselves are less safe or the people involved are less interested, whatever it may be. The 7,000 first converted suite is harder than the first converted suite was. And so we continue to push a framework where we make that environment able for people to convert, while we continue to put pressure really on the existing illegals by having a supply of a lot of registered suites that puts pressure on those existing illegal or non-registered suites, because people know that the registered suite has a certain inherent value of safety and requirement to it that suite that is illegal isn't, which means that people will start to pay a higher dollar for a registered suite than an illegal. And so as we move forward, we have converted a fair number. We expect that our growth in suites will be a different split moving forward, more new, less existing, recognizing that those existing are harder and harder to convert.
Having been involved with many investors over the years in the Calgary market, I love this initiative. I think it's, like I say, I use the word progressive, but I think it's not only progressive, there's some innovation here, and you really are addressing an issue. This is where bureaucracy is getting out of the way, which is one of those rare things. And having spoke with you a couple of times, I can see why that's happening, you being the kind of leader of your team right now. Josh, the kind of one final question, and then I want to talk about how do we, where do people get a hold of you and or your team? How do they kind of initiate this? But I have one, just interesting and curious, from a perspective of, you are the manager, you are kind of leading or being the pointy end of the spear and the team that you drive. How are you measuring your success? What is your team, when you look at it at the end of your year, what do you have to have accomplished to feel like you've achieved some results?
Sure. So in the role for a little while, we presented a draft program plan recently, and it had some goals. They're not fully 100% approved yet, but I can give a sense of them. The first is a volume goal. It is truly a volume goal. We're being pushed and asked to use an incentive to push volume on suites for sure. That includes conversions, but that also includes new. That also includes backyard, so anything suite related. And so, yeah, we are going to be measuring ourselves in terms of, if we create the framework and the space for people to be successful, we expect those units to come in. We aren't in full control, obviously, as to whether or not people apply and do what needed to be done. But we believe if we create the framework, that will happen. So that is one of our goals. We also use a goal to measure our timelines associated with things. We want to turn things around, make it simple for customers. We respond to inspections next day as often as possible, something that the City of Calgary takes a lot of pride in, a quick turnaround on inspections. Our approvals framework that we have in place is to get it done in less than 7 days on turnaround on a building permit. Our trade permits are instantly approved. So we really have a framework where, when you start to work with us on this, the intention is to make it as quick and as simple. We've removed fees to make it even cheaper for people where we can. That's all in place as well. So we're measured on numbers, we're measured on our speed and our accuracy, and then we're also going to have some goals associated with our internal success parameters. We're trying to remove backlog. So we have a lot of active permits that the people haven't finished the pieces of work yet, whether that be because of lack of finances on their own side or whatnot. And so we actually have some measures around the existing active permits and taking the steps that we need to take to move them forward. That does include a piece of enforcement that we need to continue to follow up on, to make sure that we're continuing to, yes, educate people, an education first enforcement policy, but we do need to make sure that they come to conclusion on that. And if they need to remove the suite, then that's appropriate, then they can do so. But we are generally pushing them. So those are the three key aspects that we're measuring within the team: the volumes, our timelines, as well as a backlog.
Beautiful. So how do people, I got one more question, and then if it's a rabbit hole, I don't want to go down it because I want to bring you back. We'll have another conversation on another day. But when we talk about secondary suites, does that include perhaps laneway homes, coach homes, that kind of thing as well? Does that fall under your your area of responsibility?
Yeah, a great question. I think that's still a topic of discussion. I think in general, yeah, suites are something that we consider backyard suites as part of the overall. Our focus currently, I mean, I could get the numbers, but I mean, it is a fraction of laneway homes. But
Yeah.
with zoning changes potentially coming early Q2 next year for the city of Calgary, as well as I've met with a number of modular builders, backyard suite builders in the city of Calgary. I've attended some discussions like this, whether it be in person or webinar, around backyard suites and laneway suites. The framework for them is really starting to come around to the point where the city's gotten out of the way on those as well a little bit. They're obviously a little bit more involved because of the possible impacts on other people. And so the development permit process remains key. But in terms of the rest of the framework that the city has in order for people to put these in, it's getting to the point where you'll see an influx of them. You mix that with some local modular builders that are ready to plop those things on site 6 weeks after you order it, and I think that we're going to see some growth there as well, which is fantastic because backyard suites are a way of increasing density in a great way in developed areas, depending on the circumstances. So, yes, that being said, like we don't know for sure, incentives might affect both sides of that coin. So there could be that we have some of that going on for backyard suites as well.
That's fantastic. Well, Josh, I'll definitely be sending you a note to get you back on the show and having some more conversation about what's going on in Calgary. I'd love to have more conversation and appreciate you taking the time today to come out. How do people kind of not necessarily connect with you, but how do people go about? Where do they send a note to, or how do they reach out to the City of Calgary? Where do they go to a specific department?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, great opportunity for the next month or so. We still have an engagement portal open. If you go to calgary.ca/suites feedback, you can actually move in, and there's some surveys there for people with illegal suites, or sorry, unregistered suites, registered suites. We also have some questions for renters as well, because we're trying to make sure that we understand the customers that are going to be renting these spaces and what matters to them in that. So we have some formal feedback that's currently open. From that site, there's plenty of ways of connecting with us. We have a call center, we have a chat. We also respond through in-person inquiries, and all of our applications are available online along with walkthroughs. We have other webinars that specifically walk through the application processes, that walk through the code processes, the specific elements of code. Those are accessed on our website too, which is calgary.ca/secondary suites. So all of those things are primarily there online. If you're not able to go online, you can reach out to us by phone, 403-268-5311, and or chat as well, if that's how you do it. So there's lots of different ways to reach out to us directly. You can reach out to me directly. My email is firstname.lastname, so joshua.howes, HOWES, @calgary.ca. I don't mind responding to people directly as well.
Fantastic. Josh, thanks again for joining me on the show today, sharing these insights. It's appreciated.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Anytime. Take care.